Tonight is it's the first in a series of a new partnership, and I'm going to let Bruce tell you about it. But to introduce it is Bruce Halzinger. He's a literary scholar and fiction writer teaching at the University of Virginia. His most recent novel, The Gifted School, won the Colorado Book Award. He is editor-in-chief of the journal New Literary History and the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. So please welcome Bruce.
Thank you so much, Melody, and thank you to everyone here at the Center for Fiction who's helped put this together, Eliana and Melanie, Susanna Porter on the board, and Christina Baker-Klein on the Writers' Council for their enthusiasm in promoting this idea. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this evening program featuring Carolyn Dinshaw and Garth Greenwell. Tonight marks the first event in a new occasional series called Creative Writing and Critical Thought, which aims to explore the relationship between the public and academic contexts of the literary arts, bringing together novelists and poets with literary theorists and literary historians. Creative Writing and Critical Thought will create a series of lively and in-depth conversations about the state of literary practice and study in contemporary American culture. And it's appropriate that the series is being co-sponsored by a public-facing institution like the Center for Fiction and an academic journal like New Literary History. Published by Johns Hopkins University Press and based at the University of Virginia, NLH has long featured the world's most prominent scholars of literary theory and history. Our many contributors over the years have included Jacques Derrida, Gayatri Spivak, Judith Butler, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Bruno Latour, Terry Eagleton, Richard Rorty, Sara Ahmed, many others. The journal has always fostered rigorous analysis and critique of literary practices from the ancient world through the present moment. Only rarely, though, have makers of literature featured in our pages to engage with the questions raised by their academic colleagues, theorizing the literary enterprise. And in this respect, NLH reflects the often siloed nature of literary study and practice as institutionalized in the university, with MFA programs often walled off from literary history, literary theorists toiling away on questions of historicism, new formalism, post-structuralism, narrativity, and so on, often without consulting the creative writers down the hall. I'm being somewhat reductive. There are many ways that literary theory and literary practice have been in genuine dialogue over the last half century, to say nothing of poets and novelists whose work engages directly with the critical idioms of theory. We might think of someone like Maggie Nelson, whose verse and memoirs regularly speak the intricate patois of feminist theory and psychoanalysis, or a book like Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, which has influenced two generations of Americanists writing on race, whiteness, and the politics of literary history. All of this is important background to creative writing and critical thought, which hopes to spark a series of conversations beginning tonight between some of the most prominent and influential literary theorists and the most admired and challenging writers of fiction and poetry working today. The conversations that result will be published in NLH as well as online, creating a living record of dialogues among a variety of writers and theorists thinking together about the nature and role of creative practice. So in February, we'll hear the novelist Katie Kitamura in conversation with the translation theorist Emily Apter on translation in theory and imagination. In June, we're still looking for an exact date. Our interlocutors will be Fred Moten and Renee Gladman on collaboration at the edges of Black thought. And tonight, Carolyn Dinshaw and Garth Greenwell will speak on queer theory, queer fiction. Carolyn Dinshaw is Julia Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and English at New York University, one of the world's leading scholars of queer theory and LGBTQ studies. She's a medievalist, which is how I first met her. Her research not only focuses on the late Middle Ages in England and beyond, but also explores the relationship of past to present. Her award-winning book, Chaucer's Sexual Poetics, was the first full-length study of Chaucer. She followed this with two books that developed analyses of desires for the past, Getting Medieval, Sexualities and Communities, Pre- and Postmodern, which appeared in 1999, and How Soon Is Now, Medieval Texts, Amateur Readers, and the Queerness of Time. She co-founded the flagship journal of LGBTQ studies, GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies. Before moving to NYU, Carolyn taught for many years at the University of California at Berkeley, where she was instrumental in the early development of the field. At NYU, she founded and directed the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and more recently served as Dean for the Humanities. And if she seems relaxed tonight, she stopped doing that a few months ago. So you'll see why. In the classroom, she regularly teaches materials past and present in courses ranging from medieval misogyny to queer New York City. Garth Greenwell is the author of the acclaimed Cleanness, published by FSG in 2020, a work of fiction that Colm Tobin, on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, called bravura writing and brilliantly executed. Frank Biddard hailed it as a masterpiece and compared Greenwell to Joyce and Lawrence. Cleanness was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and was longlisted for the Gordon Burns Prize, the Joyce Carol Oates Prize, and Francis Prasad. It was named a New York Times notable book, a New York Times Critics Top 10 Book of the Year, a Best Book of 2020 by The New Yorker, Time, NPR, the BBC, and more than 30 other publications. His first novel, What Belongs to You, won the British Book Award for the debut of the year, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and was a finalist for 6 other awards, including the Penn Faulkner Award, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. It was named a Best Book of 2016, again by over 50 publications in 9 countries, and was praised as the great gay novel for our times by the New Republic, and it's been translated so far into 14 languages. His short fiction appears in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, A Public Space, and Vice, and he's written criticism for The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, and Harper's, among others. So I can't tell you what a great pleasure it is to bring these 2 writers and thinkers before us this evening. Thank you.
Still feels so strange to be doing real events with actual people and not just a screen. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank the Center for Fiction and New Literary History. Thank you, Bruce, for the invitation. I first encountered Carolyn Dinshaw's work in my very first semester as a newly minted student of literature, after having been a student of opera in the conservatory, having given up one life to try to claim another. I took a course on Chaucer with a man named Robert Stein at SUNY Purchase, who insisted that I read Chaucer's Sexual Poetics. And it has been thrilling to read and reread Carolyn's work, and to see maybe more clearly than I consciously realized how much ideas from Chaucer's Sexual Poetics, ideas that you've carried through the body of your work, really served as a kind of, or maybe sort of set the points of a compass in a certain way for thinking about queerness, aesthetics, negation, affirmation, all sorts of things that I hope we'll talk about. But Carolyn and I received the title of this talk. It was not generated by us. And so I thought, we thought, we might begin by asking each other, and I'll ask you, sort of, what does queer theory mean? How do you understand it? And how do you understand it now, as opposed to when you began your career?
Okay, well, if you feel weird in a kind of in-person event for the first time in a long time, you know, I'm a medievalist. My authors are dead. But I will say it's such a thrill to meet you. I read What Belongs to You in 2016 when it came out. I don't even know how I came upon it, but probably one of those 50 publications that recommended it. But I was just completely blown away by the beauty of the prose, the clarity and precision, the ambition to, as you say, not only present what do you say in one essay? What it is to face another person. But I really felt that you're doing so much more than that. There's so much intimate intersubjectivity that happens in the reading of your work. For me, it was sometimes hard to follow who is speaking,
Right.
because who taught you not to use quotation marks? Was that Bob Stein?
Why are you beginning by attacking me? I didn't know it was going to be that kind of talk.
But so there's some at times there's a melding of voices, but there's also a real invitation to the reader to move into the interiority of the subjects and become part of them. So that's one of the things I value so much about your work, is that intimacy that you provide. But to the question about queer theory. So I know I'm the queer theory part of the show, but I've never thought of my work as queer theory or myself as a queer theorist. That designation has always been bestowed on me by others. Maybe that means that I just never know what I'm doing. But the first time that interpolation into the field happened was in the late 80s. A graduate student at Berkeley, where I taught for the 80s and 90s, brilliant graduate student, Simon Stern, was compiling a bibliography of this new emergent field of lesbian and gay studies. And he put my article, Eunuch Hermeneutics, on that bibliography. And I was really surprised by that. I was intrigued. My article didn't have anything to do with lesbians or gays. So what Simon had picked up on was that the article, and it actually formed the last chapter of Chaucer's Sexual Poetics, was really straining against the boundaries of that book. The framework of that book was the gender binaries of masculine and feminine. And I was trying in that last chapter to try to conceptualize, in response to one of Chaucer's characters on the Canterbury Pilgrimage, a personhood that was beyond gender categorization. And I wanted to value that personhood. So that was what Simon was picking up on. And in a year or two, that kind of conceptualization became increasingly known as queer theory. And that sense of radical, because everything was radical at that time, uncategorizability became known as queerness. Right? So it turned out that I flourished in that space that I had been interpolated into. I loved the refusal of gender categories and the identities that they grounded. I found that very freeing, particularly revelatory for me. And this came through reading Gender Trouble for the first time in 1989, late 89, was not only the performativity of gender that is the most well-known emergent concept from that book, but also Butler's idea of the heterosexual matrix. Do you remember that? That she's talking about an identity that requires the coherence of your gender, your desire, and your body morphology. And I thought that her analysis of that matrix and the attendant energy in trying to disarticulate those things
Mm.
and make room for new combinations, new possibilities for persons was super exciting.
Yeah.
Another thing that I really loved in that early moment of queer theory was an essay that Eve Sedgwick wrote called Queer and Now. It's in Tendencies. And in that short essay, she puts that idea of the heterosexual matrix in an even broader context. She talks about the ways in which heterosexuality is part of this whole mechanism by which religion, the state, capital, political ideology, domesticity, all these discourses of power and legitimacy speak with one voice.
Mm.
And she uses the example of Christmas to exemplify that, which it seems so explanatory to me. She was writing in probably 1991, the Gulf War and so on. And so she said, you know, you get questions like, will the hostages be free for Christmas? And we hear that now in our pandemic times. Will we be able to travel for Christmas?
Right.
So I loved that analysis of the ways these institutions require this forced coherence. And what queer theory was trying to do was just to burst that apart and provide some air for some other possibilities. So just one quotation from Sedgwick, because it's so beautiful. She asks, what if we could value the ways in which meanings and institutions can be at loose ends with each other? Mm. And that's just such a Sedgwick little turn of phrase there. So this is a very charged time. While I was writing, queerness knocks signifiers loose, ungrounding bodies, making them strange. It was really exhilarating. This was the late 80s, the early 90s. I was living in San Francisco. I was teaching at Berkeley. Foucault was there. Butler wasn't there yet. But one thing that is really important to remember is that all of this academic, emergent, exciting work was fueled by the affect and the activism around HIV/AIDS. So in my own work as a medievalist, as I saw people and whole communities just dying, I wondered how we could find a way of using the past as a resource for community building now. So that's what I tried to develop in Getting Medieval. And I refused linearity. We were refusing a lot of things, and linearity, that had to go. Teleology also. And I developed this idea of a queer touch across time, where one could form a friendship, a kinship relation, a community across the ages, and that would be a resource for not only the present but also the future. So a reader's report for Getting Medieval, where I developed that, called me a queer theorist, and I was flattered. I think medievalists are really susceptible to flattery because we're so often ignored, you know? So I was flattered. I just thought the term should be reserved for the big guys, whom I've already cited. But I guess what this aria is all about is that for me, queer theory is an historical term. Mm. It's very rooted in that 90s context. And well, Heather Love whose work I know you admire, has said that queer theory was never expected to age. It was always just that thing of the now, and of that particular period. A scholar, Kaji Amin, says that queer theory represented a particular moment wherein same-sex sexuality, political urgency, and radical transgression all converged. So tonight's invitation, queer theory, queer fiction, surprised me. And once again, I didn't identify myself as a queer theorist. I'm not really hailed by that term. For one thing, it's singular, queer theory. And one of the things that I'm finding so productive in our moment of cultural production right now is an insistence on plurality of multiplicity. I think of Fred Moten's trilogy called Consent Not to Be a Single Being. So there's that problem with it. I think the theory part is also a problem because of the goal of abstraction away from the social. That's just not interesting to me or useful to me in what I'm trying to do now, which is really just find and explore different ways of being in the world. One of the things that we kidded ourselves with was this idea that queer theory could emerge from anywhere and could be done by anyone. And that's a great theory. But in reality, queer theory emerged from elite academic institutions in the US and in the UK by mainly white practitioners. And so it had a lot of blind spots: race, ethnicity, religion, body, ability, social economic class, and so I think it was very limited in that way as well, limited by its situation of emergence, right? So I think now that what we might call the field is unfolding in myriad ways. One of the things that's happening, I think, is there's a return to identity. I mean, queer theory was at its core radically anti-identitarian because identities, Saint Foucault told us, were the vectors by which power incorporated persons, right? But I think there's a return to identities because also at queer theory's heart, there was always a very a close care, an intimate relationship to lesbian and gay lives, and bisexual and trans to a certain extent. So now I think that things are coming around. We're taking the lessons of queer theory, like the destabilization of gender binaries, like the institutional analysis of heterosexuality, but we're moving toward the blind spots that queer theory wasn't able to touch. If I were to think of an appropriate rubric for what I think I'm doing, I guess it's queer studies. Could also be queer thought, if we imagine thought is fully embodied as well. So that's what it means to me. And so if I turn the question back to you, you're the queer fiction part of our show. How do you feel about that term? And is it adequate for your sense of what you're doing?
So I feel like it's a question to which I have various answers. So there's one and the answer kind of depends on the spirit in which the question is offered. So when What Belongs to You came out, I was amazed by sort of the ubiquity of the question, do you consider yourself a gay writer or a queer writer? I don't think those terms were used with a very meaningful difference.
Right.
Or do you think of yourself as a universal writer? So like, you know, are you a gay writer, or are you a writer who happens to be gay? And then when I would say, oh, well, you know, I do think I'm a queer writer. Yes, that does seem meaningful to me. And then there would be the question, but don't you want to be a writer for everyone? And so a lot of the conversations around What Belongs to You for me were really about wanting to just set that particular question on fire.
Right.
And, you know, to insist that not only is it backed by a kind of densely impacted homophobic narrative, but also it makes a mistake about how art works. This idea, I mean, I want at once to find, and I do think the way in which they were using this idea of the universal is just radically problematic and bankrupt. But then there is a kind of universality that I do believe in. And that seems to me really, like I need the idea of universality to understand part of my experience of art, which is the fact that I can read Chaucer or Catullus or Sappho or Chimamanda Adichie or Mishima. And not despite, but because each of those writers is so extraordinarily devoted to particularities of time, of place, of bodies, of communities, they arrive at something that feels like it is teaching me about myself and teaching me about some shared experience of humanness. So I feel like there's like a legitimate idea of universality and an illegitimate idea of universality. And queerness for me, like if what I write is able to communicate across particularity, it's not because it has somehow attempted to leapfrog particularity, to erase particularity and write into this universal. It's instead precisely because it is so utterly devoted to particularity. And I was, well, it's wrong to say I was determined, because I wasn't determined to do anything when I wrote my first novel. I had no idea what I was doing. I was really just trying to write one sentence after another. But I certainly was not trying to package the value of the lives and communities I was writing about in a way that would make that the value of those lives immediately legible to a mainstream. Like, that was just not interesting to me. I didn't want to like write a user's guide to cruising, or, you know, sort of explain why. Well, I mean, I've said before that a certain professor at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, whom I revere and continue to revere, her response to my work was that it read like a sociological report on the practices of a subculture, which was an amazing comment to me, because somehow men having sex with men in a bathroom or in a forest, that writing about that was reporting on the practices of a subculture. But writing about a rural Congregationalist minister in Iowa was writing about universal humanness. So that's just to say, I absolutely claimed this title of queer writer, but in my terms, what that meant to me. The term, so I do find both queer and fiction, like they're both terms I want to talk about and worry at a little bit. Fiction is actually not a super meaningful term to me. I was not trained as a fiction writer. I was not, you know, I always read novels voraciously, but I never read novels with a kind of passionate identification in the way that I read poems, or in the way that I experienced music, which were my two earlier educations in art. American fiction, certainly fiction in general, and especially American fiction, is not really super meaningful to me as a context for my work. Art is a meaningful context for my work. And, you know, I think, like, if someone wants to try to think about the structure of what belongs to you, I think they should look to Britain's chamber operas. If they want to think about the structure of cleanness, I think they would learn more from Winterheiser Dichterliebe than they would learn from Dubliners, you know? So in that sense, like, fiction is not meaningful to me, but art is super meaningful to me. And then the question of the queer side of it, you know, because as in some of the ways you were talking about, you know, queerness as a concept that at once constitutes identity and also dissolves identity. And that to me is something crucial in the idea of queerness. Queerness feels deeply meaningful to me as a term of both experience, my lived identity and reality, and also art. Queer aesthetics feels really meaningful to me. And when I write, I do feel, I hope very much, I think one of my motivations for writing is to participate in what feels to me like a durably and continuingly vibrant conversation between artists across time, which is all that a tradition is. And that tradition of queer artists talking to each other across time, well, it's just, it's one reason I write is because I want to chat with Hervé Guibert and James Baldwin, you know, and Virginia Woolf. I think that at the same time, if I try to think about, well, but what does that actually mean? Like, if I try to be sort of rigorous about, like, what do I actually mean by queerness? It then becomes very hard to say. And I teach pretty often a course, a seminar on queer aesthetics. And that really makes me confront the problem. Like, here I am sort of in a professorial role, claiming to have a subject. And yet the bulk of the beginning of that class is about the fact that if I think there is anything I can sort of categorically say that is definitional of queerness, it is an allergy to definition. You know what I mean? If definition is necessarily about delimitation, about drawing lines, about saying what is or what isn't, then that feels to me like the minute we start trying to answer the question, what do you mean by queer? We have fallen into a kind of straight logic. Like that we've given up the whole game if we start trying to say, well, what is queer and what isn't? And so I begin my queer aesthetics seminar by sort of saying, you know, and this is a real pleasure I take in being an artist and not a scholar, because I don't have to have an argument. And I'm totally fine with saying, I'm not interested in queer as a kind of logically defensible category. I'm not interested in a kind of, you know, a definition that would pass muster. I'm interested in affective allegiances and in libidinal impulses. So I'm interested, when I teach queer aesthetics, I'm interested in what feels to us queer and what as artists can we use? What feels inspirational? What turns me on? What feels affectively hot to me? And in some sense, you know, I do think if one allows oneself to fall into that kind of trap of the definitional game, it can seem like, oh, but actually there's no there. Like if sort of queerness is not exactly about specific bodies or specific bodily practices. It's not exactly about that. It's not exactly about sexual identification. It's not exactly about who you sleep with. Well, then you can sort of say, well, but there's no there. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a sort of, it can mean whatever you want it to mean.
Does that bother you?
Well, so it's interesting because then I sort of start to think, well, but so maybe queerness isn't like a real thing. And yet, as an artist, I can say, but it has real effects. Because what feels to me like queerness results in my definitely real books. And so this idea that maybe queerness is a kind of imaginary garden that nourishes real toads, you know, that then as an artist, I can say, great. And a large part of what, you know, so I guess I would say, and to me, there is something that feels queer to me in trusting the affective, in trusting the libidinal, and in insisting that that is a kind of sufficient authority for the practice of making art and the practice of living a life, making a life.
So I think there are a bunch of things that I want to ask you about, but when you say, I'm so happy I'm an artist and not a scholar.
Truly.
And yet, there's so much fascinating stuff going on in scholarship, valorizing feeling, for example.
Sure.
And even very disciplinarily trained historians are recognizing the usefulness of educated guesses, that we always deliver only the possible and probable. Even the most rigorous scholarship does that. And so historians, I'm thinking of the medievalist Ruth Mazokaras, has recently written that when we don't have sources, when we're really fully absorbed in our materials, then there is room for imagination. So you get a book like Saidiya Hartman's, what is it, Wayward Girls, Beautiful Experiments. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which has a cast of characters, and which uses those educated guesses, which I guess you could call fiction, in this work that has been praised as, you know, a really substantial work of history. Right. So one thing that just really excites me about what's going on right now in scholarship is that I think that the line between you know, as Bruce put it, makers and scholars is definitely blurred. I mean, Bruce himself is a medievalist, award-winning medievalist who has written fictional books, historical fiction, full of educated guesses, right? Because completely steeped in resources or in the sources that do exist. So that's one thing that I'm finding that is really bringing our fields or our endeavors together. I feel very strongly. When we were talking earlier, you referred to a kind of writerliness in queer theory and queer scholarship. I know it's extremely important. Part of my scholarly practice is the actual writing. and finding the perfect word. So sometimes it does feel like poetry. So there's that aspect too, but this larger place for the recognition of the use of imagination in scholarship, I find so freeing. And so, well, it's just honest. We're finally being honest, right? So one of the things that you said about universality and what you're really interested in is that you want to get to the representation of shared humanness. So what about the characters, the character in Cleanness who says, I want to be a thing. I want to be made an object. I want to be a whole.
Right.
What?
And I want to be nothing.
I want to be nothing.
Yeah.
Right. Right. But so I want to be nothing. There's a kind of mystical negativity going on there. But we could also talk about what it means when a human says, I want to be an instrument or I want to be an object. Because I think there's really interesting work going on in scholarship that is demonstrating the embeddedness of the human in the non-human, and actually the inseparability of the human and non-human. So could you just talk about that?
Sure.
I want to be an instrument. I think you talk about the exhilaration of being made an object.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, a few different things. It does seem to me, I like what you say about boundaries between, you know, the different kinds of making that are scholarship and fiction. Because I do think finally that's true, that I mean, really, it's the endeavor to try to make sense of our lives, to try to make meaning that this is about, and a sense of dissatisfaction in scholarship with the way that disciplinarity can cut us off from some of our human resources for trying to make meaning. And I feel the same thing may be happening in a certain kind of fiction that's really interested in, I mean, we had a mention of Maggie Nelson, a poet and nonfiction, creative nonfiction writer. I think also, you know, what's sometimes called autofiction, which I think is a pretty silly term, but this sort of a group of writers who are interested in what is actually the oldest game in literature and nothing new, but a kind of blurring of fictionality, of invention and non-invented fictionality, and also incorporating the essayistic into narrative prose. That too feels like claiming some of these human resources we have for thinking about meaning. It seems to me really important for thinking about meaning, or I guess any kind of thinking about meaning that's going to feel genuine or legitimate or earned to me, has to acknowledge non-meaning, has to acknowledge the always present possibility that we are telling ourselves stories in the dark that point nowhere. I am thinking a lot, maybe because it feels like such a negative time we've been living through, and also because I just think temperamentally there is an awful lot in me that wants to say no to life. I've been thinking a lot about affirmation and about the fact that one of the reasons I need art, and something that I do think is crucial to the art, to the work that art does and the way that art helps us live, is that art gives us a reason to say yes to life. But for that yes to be meaningful, for that yes to help me say yes, I have to feel in it the no it has passed through. I can't feel that it's turned its back on negation, that it's turned its back on the abyss, that it's turned its back on just the meaningless nihilism that undergirds us all. but that instead it's faced up to it and passed through it and somehow found in negation. In this via negativa apophatic theology sort of way, affirmation that, as I hope, I hope sort of what cleanness dramatizes the book is that finally this great deconstructive truth, which is also the apophatic truth, in cleanness we find filth, in filth we find cleanness, that in these categories, these lines we draw, these categories we build, that in fact, they're always falling apart. And there's something terrible in that and also something hopeful in that. And when I think about like what excites me in queer art, in art that feels queer to me, in queer aesthetics, it was actually super helpful to me to reread your 3 books, because I think there are ideas that go through your entire work, including to what you're working on now, which is really very different work on sort of mirages. But this idea, so eunuch hermeneutics, which I feel like all of you have read. And if you haven't, you have to run home and read it, because it really is just one of the most tremendous pieces of thinking I know. But you articulate, and it's funny because you say, well, that's not really an article that has to do with lesbians and gays. Yeah, I'm like, that is the article that to me is so clarifying about what queerness is. And this idea of eunuch hermeneutics, which is a kind of meaning making that recognizes meaninglessness, a kind of object formation that recognizes the partiality of all objects. And you have this wonderful sort of distillation of eunuch logic, which is, je sais bien mais quand même. I know that, I know well, and yet. And to me, there is something in that. I know this thing is true about reality, and yet I'm going to turn to the fictional, to the counter reality, and affirm something, even though I know that affirmation is not exactly pointing to the truth or pointing to wholeness or pointing to cleanness or pointing to any of these categories. So that idea of eunuch hermeneutics, that idea of how we can recognize a kind of fundamental brokenness in the world, in humanness and meaning making, that does not fundamentally cut us off from the world, from humanness, from meaning making. And then also another thing all of your work has been about is,
I love this.
I'm glad, because I was a little worried about telling Carolyn Dinshaw what her work is about. But no, this is, what I mean is ways in which I do feel that encountering your work when I was very young and just forming myself as a literary person really did kind of set a course, which Bruce did not know when he thought of putting us together. And when I got this email saying, would you be interested in the conversation with Carolyn Dinshaw? I thought, would I? Like, I was so excited.
But, can I just make a parenthesis here?
Sure, of course.
I think Bruce, and you can confirm this later, there's a pretty famous medieval poem called Cleanness.
There is indeed. I had no idea.
I was really, I've been straining to find relationships between that and your work, and I think they can be found, but I think it is a coincidence.
Well, no, it's not a coincidence. No.
Okay.
Oh no, I mean the Pearl Poet is like it's really important. Yeah,
down with the Pearl Poet. Okay.
Very much so. But that idea of cleanness. So cleanness is a medieval poem. It's funny. No interviewer ever asked me about it. But Cleanness is the title of a medieval poem, and it's a medieval poem that recounts several biblical narratives, and very importantly, recounts the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that to me is the nightmare vision of cleanness. That is where being a certain kind of commitment to cleanness leads. It leads to a scorched earth where nothing can live. So I don't think like my book is an intricate conversation with the book, but it was not coincidental.
Okay, just FYI, Cleanness is an editorial name because, medieval poems weren't really given names.
Don't take it away from me, Carolyn.
But so it used to be known as purity, just by the way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So,
Which is interesting because, also in almost all the languages cleanness is being translated into, purity is the only available term, which is of course very different from cleanness.
it is.
But purity, like it's pureza, it's pureté,
Mhm.
it's Reinheit, like that's the, so anyway, I love that English has this word that feels very different from purity or cleanliness. But I was going to say quickly, the other thing that I think is super exciting in queer aesthetics that your work has engaged with is affective connections between the present and the past.
Right.
And that idea of being led by desire, being led by affect, to touch something in the past and finding there something that allows us to live in the future and live in the present and imagine the future.
Mhm.
Like that to me is something that when I look at a dancer like Kyle Abraham, or when I look at a performer like Taylor Mack, or, I see in many queer artists that impulse that we turn to the past as a way to help us see the present and imagine the future.
Mhm. Mhm.
I cannot believe how late it is, Carolyn.
I can't believe it either.
Like, I
You know,
think
we had this whole itinerary.
but it also happened. So we had 2 Zoom conversations and it was like this, like we would start talking and then 2 seconds later we would say, Carolyn, it's been an hour. Like what's happened?
Yeah,
But we
it's
do want to have some questions from
from the audience. Yeah.
audience.
Can we take 5 minutes and let's see, give some ideas of what we would want young people like our students to read in these very troubled times?
Well, I definitely want to take down your list. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I want to hear your list for sure. Okay. So I would say I thought of 4 books. Audre Lorde's Zami, because I feel it's just inexhaustible, right? I think the history that the narrative imparts is so important. The development of Black feminist thought and Black lesbian thought, but also, she narrates an illegal abortion,
Right.
and unfortunately, that's
Very timely.
It's very timely,
Yeah.
indeed. She also this idea arises so organically from that narrative of how to live in what she calls the house of difference. And I think, that is, it's a really amazing interpretation of well, it's like deconstruction in another register.
Right.
So Zami, I would also teach Close to the Knives, David Wojnarowicz.
Very close to my heart. Yeah.
That kind of rage and love and intensity seem more and more relevant now that we're in culture wars again.
Right.
Can you believe it? The commitment to acting and activism, the commitment to love.
Yeah.
So definitely that book, and also because students need to know about the AIDS crisis. They really need to know that history. There's a book by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney called The Undercommons.
Yeah.
Do you know that book?
Oh, yeah.
Such a rousing manifesto for finding subversive intellectual spaces in the, what does he call it? I think in the inner outside of the university, and to recognize that exploitive labor policies demean everyone's labor in the university, finding how to think for and with others, and trying to find ways of different ways that the unpredictable can happen.
Right.
So that book, especially for graduate students.
Yeah.
And then for everlasting love, I would say The Prophets by Robert Jones
Oh,
Jr.
interesting. Oh, sure. Yeah, it was just a finalist for the National Book Award.
Yeah. Just because it's that the ending is so coruscatingly beautiful. It's still, in my mind. But it's centering homosocial relations and homosexual same-sex relations within chattel slavery in the
Right.
US, I think is just brilliant and important and very moving.
Yeah.
That's my list. What is your list?
Well, so I'm not going to give a list. I am constantly making book recommendations on social media, so you can find them there. But also in our imaginings, we were going to end by talking about teaching. And I was actually not going to talk about what, but instead how, and talk about teaching workshop and ways in which I try to reimagine what a workshop can be. A workshop where the material is not provided by me, the material is provided by students, but where I'm very suspicious of a workshop model. And I'm very suspicious of the ways in which authority is formed within a traditional workshop model. And so thinking about ways to teach workshop that try to break that down. But I would really love to take at least a few questions, a couple of questions, if anybody has any.
Definitely.
So if anyone has a question, you can go right up to the microphone in the middle of the aisle and then form a line through the aisle.
Oof, a line. I feel like in the very few live events I've done, the sort of dreaded pause before the first question is now much longer, just on the other side of lockdown. Hi.
We'll use the pause. Hi. My question is prompted by Garth. You mentioned at the beginning you were kind of trying to find a kind of a connection between the particular and the universal. And
Yeah.
when you were talking about that, I was thinking, oh, the real, like that's maybe the thing that connects the two between, because the real is very particular and reality is universal. And so I was wondering what relation your work had to the real. And especially when you were saying similarly that you don't ascribe to a fiction identity, but I was wondering what relationship your work has to reality. And to Carolyn, as a kind of a side note, why does the Academy struggle so much with using the category real rather than say realism? Like what do you think, what relationship do you think reality has in the Academy and in scholarship today, and what kind of struggles does it find there?
It's so funny because, I want to utterly reject the idea of reality. I really, it's funny as you say that, because I'm like, wow, that does absolutely follow from what I said, and yet absolutely not, no. Because, in some sense, I really do question our access to a kind of reality that we could all agree is there and experience in the same way. So in some sense, I would want to really trouble the idea of the real or of reality. And I don't think actually that's quite, because, in some sense, when you talk about the real in that way, I imagine something that escapes subjectivity. And actually the kind of humanness that I feel in art is really super saturated with subjectivity. So it's not like it gets us to some object out there. It's instead about, again, kind of about how we make meaning in ways that feel recognizable across great gulfs of distance, of difference. But what would you say about the idea of the real and reality?
Well, usually when people pose questions that include that word, they're talking about the real world versus the Academy.
Oh, interesting, right?
And I think this is actually a really big deal. I wouldn't use the real world, but I would think in terms of the public. So there is this emergent field called public humanities,
Right.
for example, and there's something called applied social sciences as well that I think are trying to address what our questionnaire called the real. For me, I think that all humanities are public humanities. This is kind of my thing. I was dean for humanities, so I wanted to be, that big dean. But ideas of the public really frame our work, and yet we don't really acknowledge that. We are privileged to pursue our passions, but we don't often answer to the publics that inform our work, the idea of whom constitutes our disciplines. So I think that thanks for the question, because I think the idea of the academy and the real world, but I would want to say, a non-academic public, is increasingly important now. When, well, you know what I'm going to say, that higher education is really less and less valued, and is seen as a value proposition. I think that's the term.
Yeah.
Rather than a kind of search for our shared humanity.
One of my favorite lines in your books, you're talking about some of those ridiculous congressional debates in the 90s around funding for the arts and the humanities, and some Republican senator sort of saying, just scoffing at the idea of giving money to support a program studying Gregorian chant. And there's just
going to be a database for Gregorian chant. Yeah.
I mean, and there's this wonderful line where you just think, imagine a grown adult not understanding the importance of studying Gregorian chant. And I just thought, thank you, Carolyn Dinshaw, for speaking for me. Absolutely. But I mean, I do think something that you're talking about that I think about a lot is the trap of relevance. This idea that we can know what we need from art, so that we can read the back of a book or the description of a movie and say, oh, that's going to help me live, or it's not. Well, that's not how art works,
Yeah, and that's not really the way learning works.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I think Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in the Undercommons say, let's get away from teaching as mere knowledge production, because we can't know what is going to be important.
Totally. Totally. I wonder if we have time for one more question, maybe, just to get at least two other voices in the room.
Hi, Garth. A lot of your work explores the nature of consent in the gay community, which is something that I cherish because I feel like it doesn't get written about enough. But I'm wondering from you if you believe that this generation of gay men is due for their own Me Too-like reckoning.
Well, that's a devastating question.
Do you think time's up?
I'm so sorry. No, I would love to answer that question responsibly, and I'm not sure that I can. I feel, as always, super contradictory things. On one hand, very early in the sort of eruption of the Me Too movement, I got an email from some glossy magazine saying, Garth, we want you to write a hot take. They actually said hot take. We want you to write a hot take. We want the gay Me Too essay. And I just said, absolutely not. But then I also thought, the question of consent, the question of the extent to which our desires are knowable, my commitment both to respecting the sovereignty of other peoples, my experience of the violation of that sovereignty, my cherishing of ways in which desire has been educative of me because I did not know what I desired until I was pushed into the desire for it. The centrality to my own sexual life of spaces in which one can experience the terror and also the exhilaration of a performance of non-consent within an aesthetic frame, like an S&M encounter. My sense that there are historically specific cultural forms of queer life and queer eros, maybe especially around cross-generational relationships, educative relationships, that have become very hard to think about in the fullness of their complexity. Teaching both graduate students and undergraduates, I am often surprised. Well, I'm surprised by the response to all sorts of texts. But I'm especially surprised. I recently taught a course in which Alexander Chee's utterly brilliant, gorgeous, incredibly nuanced and careful novel, Edinburgh, broke my class. Because they simply, my students, very thoughtful, wonderful students, did not have a kind of conceptual apparatus that would allow them to see the complexity of the relationship in Edinburgh between a 25-year-old man and a 17-year-old adolescent. And their sense of deep disturbance that the book did not clearly and finally condemn that relationship and give them a stable ground of righteousness from which to judge it. Which to me, the whole point of art is to take that ground away from us. But I realized as I was trying to understand the intensity of my response to the desire for a hot take on consent in queer relationships, is that that is one of the questions that for me, because of the way I'm made, I need art to think about. None of my other tools will let me think about that in a way that feels adequate to my sense of the complexity of the question. And so I hope it's the opposite of my cold take, my very long, slow, tepid, ambiguous, ambivalent take on consent in queer relationships is the last chapter of Cleanness, in which I tried to do my best, and that was not written in response to Me Too, but I tried to do my best to think about consent and what consent means, and where it's crossed and what it means if it's crossed, and what it means if you can't know if it's crossed. But I need it, and other chapters of Cleanness, obviously Gospodar and The Little Saint are about that too. Like, I need fiction to think about that. Did I not answer that question well? I was trying really hard not to answer that question.
No, I think that was really, really beautiful.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was such
Are
a
we done?
privilege. I mean, I think. 15.
Okay,
Thank you all so much.
thank you.
Thank you, Garth. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you, Bruce, for bringing this to us. And everybody have a wonderful night. Good night.